Welcome to the Retrieving Catholicity podcast, where we think about life and ministry in light of the whole truth, the whole church, and why it matters for the whole world. Welcome back to another episode of Retrieving Catholicity. I am so glad you found us here on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, or Spotify. Today, we're thinking about what it looks like to be a Baptist and how I became a Baptist. I'm going to make the case that I became a Baptist by accident and remain a Baptist by conviction. This pod will be a little bit unique. It'll be part autobiography, part theology, part history. It's a story of being Baptist, becoming Baptist, and then staying convinced Baptist. So let me explain a bit about how I became a Baptist, if you will, becoming a Baptist by accident. My grandma was a Baptist, and so my mom was a Baptist, and so we went to Baptist churches when I was growing up. And even in the times where we were in non-denominational churches, I was reminded that we were actually Baptists, right? My grandma, for instance, led the singing at Liberty Community Church, and she always referred to herself as the Baptist and Sue the Baptist, and she was very proud of that. And so Baptist identity, I guess we could say, felt safe for me when I was a kid. And I was a thoughtful little fella, in good ways and bad ways, I suppose. And so I actually did have some thoughts about, okay, like what makes Baptist identity unique? If Mama's a Baptist and if Mom is a Baptist, why should I be convinced to be a Baptist? And so I'll share a little bit about kind of what I thought. I guess this would be like late elementary, middle school, high school, were some of the hallmarks of Baptist identity. And the first is just that we base our theology on the Bible. And while other denominations did this as well, we thought our interpretation of the Bible was closest, right? So we believed the Bible before we had any interest in denominational labels. And so we wanted to be a part of a denomination that also believed the Bible. This was a more functional and specific one, though. We believe that once you are saved, you're always saved, right? Once you're in grace, you're always in grace. And this was this was kind of a hot button issue around the lunch table as we talked about church stuff. Yeah, that a lot of more popular traditions in our area really didn't hold that doctrine. And I just sort of understood it at a popular level. And now I would articulate, I would still say, of course, that I think that those who are in Christ remain in Christ. But I think there's a flippancy with which we can talk about once saved, always saved, that articulates it in such a way that is unhelpful. But all that to say, I was committed to this idea that once you're saved, you're always saved. And functionally speaking, that might have been like the biggest distinguishing factor, because we did believe, like other denominations believed, the Bible. My parents were kind people. They were gracious and humble people. And so I never got the thought that we were the only ones who believed the Bible. But I did kind of think we were the ones who really believed that once you're saved, you're always saved. And speaking of that language, saved, that was also sort of a hallmark of Baptist identity, that there should be a moment in your life where you get saved and you ask Jesus into your heart, if you will. Those two sort of phrases were used interchangeably, that, you come to an awareness of your sin and your need for a savior, and that you're spawned by getting saved. If people ask, when did you get saved? Do you want to get saved? And that getting saved language was really popular. Again, I'm not saying these things are unique to Baptist identity, getting saved, believing the Bible. No, I'm just saying this is my interpretation of what it meant to be a Baptist. And going to the next level, we should always be ready to help someone get saved. We should always be looking to help people get saved. And so, we should preach the Bible in view of a response. And so my expectation for a church service would be that the Bible would be clearly preached, the gospel would be made clear, and that people would be given this opportunity to believe. And then when we think about practice, we should read the Bible, we should pray, we should care about evangelism and missions, or taking the gospel to people down the street and to people sort of all over the world. And so you might think, did you really think that in middle school? It's well, some of those things, yeah. I knew getting saved was a big deal. I explained sort of the piety of Baptist life that I grew up in. And I knew these issues of grace were sort of debated and contested. And I guess baptism has a lot to do with all of this, because after all, it's the name, right? We're Baptists. And so surely our theology of baptism is in some way distinct enough that we should name our whole movement after it. So this baptizing of people who profess faith was also there. That kind of explained my approach to church life, to Christian identity, to Baptist identity and practice as a kid. Like I said, I knew I was a Christian before I was a Baptist, but I didn't know a ton, like historically or theologically, about Baptist identity. And I sort of settled into that rhythm for a while. I would say for most of my teenage years and then early 20s. Like generally, Baptist identity seemed safe. I agreed with what I thought it meant to be a Baptist for the most part. I hadn't really been challenged on any of those fronts yet. And so when I felt a call into ministry, which I had, in high school, I was really involved in like Fellowship of Christian Athletes, same in middle school. And so there were some people who would say, hey, you're going to be a pastor, you're going to be a preacher, et cetera. And I was disinterested for a long time. But that was in Baptist spaces. And so when I felt called to ministry, I think, well, I need to, like, I think I'm a Baptist. I've been in non-denominational spaces, but I've got this kind of Baptist. That's what my mom was. That's what my grandma was. So surely that's what I am as well. And it felt safe enough. And what I knew is I needed to be tethered to the Bible, and it felt like that identity could keep me tethered to the Bible. And so I thought, well, let's be a Baptist. Like let's as we come into adulthood, as I pursue God's call in my life, like let's do that in Baptist churches and in Baptist spaces. But I had to do one thing before I did that, right? I had to make sure that I am, in fact, a Baptist. Am I a Baptist? Like, yeah, I think so. It made a ton of sense to me practically. It felt true to my culture. And outside of just not being sure what emphasizing Baptist identity would be, I was generally cool with it. But I didn't want to put it on a billboard, I didn't want to say like, oh, Mason the Baptist, not because I was ashamed of that. No, one of my downfalls and good things, I guess, depending on context, I'm a loyal guy, and so if it's good enough for my mama, it's good enough for me. If it's good enough for my mom, then I don't want to usurp that or change that. So I would never say I was ashamed of Baptist identity, even though many sort of people in our area have had negative experiences in Baptist churches they felt were too hellfire and brimstone or too legalistic or judgmental. So that term Baptist could hold a stigma. For me, it really didn't hold a stigma, and I wasn't particularly ashamed of it, but I just didn't understand why it mattered that much, why it should be a significant part of my theological identity. And then I went to seminary. My first class at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary was Baptist History and Identity. And so it was a hybrid class, which meant you did pretty much all the work online, and then you had a couple of days in Wake Forest at Southeastern on campus. And so this was my first experience, my first time in a seminary classroom, my first time in a Christian school, Christian institution. And I found out since that some people actually think this is a dull and boring class, and I can't fathom that. I actually teach it this term at Midwestern Seminary, so I don't think it's dull or boring or anything like that. And something incredible happened in Baptist history and identity. I got some answers, and I got a whole lot more questions. I learned a lot of great Baptist names. I learned a lot about major Baptist figures. I learned a lot about the controversies that shaped Baptist identity, and I learned a lot about Southern Baptist identity, because growing up in West Virginia, there were a lot of American Baptist churches that were sort of not super tightly affiliated with the American Baptists, a lot of independent Baptist churches, and then a handful of Southern Baptist churches. But growing up, I knew only of maybe one or two. And so in this introduction to Southern Baptist world, to Baptist identity, I found something both stable and contested, if that makes sense. I found something that was sort of like fixed, and then I found something that's also kind of dynamic. Like it's stable and it's fixed in the sense that Baptist just can't mean whatever you want the word to mean. And I think this is a unique temptation for Baptist theology today. You'll hear people talk like, can I be Baptist and fill in the blank, right? We're always kind of testing the limits of Baptist identity. Some may see this project as testing the limits of Baptist identity, but I reject that premise, and maybe we'll talk about why later. So there's a confessional history. There are people who believe real things and wrote them down, and their sources and many others, like, they form the bedrock for what it means to be a Baptist. And so, because of this confessional history, because of this religious history, like the word actually means something. It's not a word devoid of meaning, but it's also, I think it's more contested than I thought. I expected to just go and get all the answers, right? This is who the first Baptist was. These are the Baptist distinctives. And what I quickly realized is that there's a lot of disagreement. There's a lot of argument in terms of, we disagree over who the first Baptist even was, right? And then which streams have been most influential in Baptist life. And I quickly found that, there are a lot of scholars who have spent a lot of time understanding the roots of Baptist identity. And I began to see that when we talk about that word Baptist, it's not just a monolith, that there are all sorts of ways of approaching Baptist identity. Now, this project begins to overlap a little bit. Some of those approaches highlight continuity with the broader Christian tradition through the Reformation, and other approaches do not highlight continuity with the broader Christian tradition. We'll spend another episode maybe in the future thinking about approaches to Baptist identity that are less Catholic. In other words, they do not highlight continuity with the broader Christian tradition as much as departure from it. But I became interested in this vision of Baptist identity that was in fundamental continuity with the Reformation. So, as the Reformation ripped through Europe, a series of events sparked by the recovery of justification by faith transpired throughout the continent, then transpired in England, that led to the recovery of a more congregational approach to church life and governance. And then that logic was extended from ecclesiology to the sacraments, specifically to baptism and the Lord's Supper. So if the centrality of faith, namely justification by faith, was a key reformational insight, like, how might that insight be driven into all areas of faith and practice, into ecclesiology, into sacramentology, into all of these things? Specifically, Baptists would say, let's take this logic of justification by faith, let's take this logic of the centrality of faith, and let's drive it into our understanding of the church. If the church should be considered as those who have faith or possess faith as the called out ones, then baptism, entry into the church, should be administered to those who possess faith. For this is how one enters the body of the faithful. The church is composed of believers, a community of those who have been justified by faith alone. This is a key bedrock Baptist distinctive. We see this approach highlighted in a recent volume, Orthodox Radicals by Matthew Bingham. I recommend you read it. It's quite expensive, so if you have a library access, use library access to get it. But he highlights what he calls Baptistic Congregationalists as these 17th century forerunners to what would develop later, he thinks, than most people say, into a capital B Baptist identity. So these Baptistic Congregationalists are like a bridge between the Reformational movement and what would become Baptists. And so specifically in England later in this century and in the next century, you got the particular Baptists and the general Baptists who are sort of distinguished from one another primarily by their soteriology or their views of the atonement. But we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about particular and general Baptists and Baptistic Congregationalists right now. Before we go too far, what am I trying to say? Just this. There are approaches to Baptist identity which highlight continuity with the Reformation, specifically as it developed in England, and through the Reformation may find continuity with the broader Christian tradition. We might think of Baptist identity then as a reformational movement that transpires within this broader Christian orthodoxy. With the reformers, early Baptists confessed the Christian faith, affirmed the creedal consensus, agreeing with the medieval divines on many fronts, but seeking a return to earlier sources, namely the Bible. In this sense, Catholicity is a popular doctrine, or becoming popular doctrine. Many are making the case for a more Catholic approach to Baptist identity. Gavin Ortland is recovering some historians who have made that argument and making it to a broader audience, specifically on YouTube. His channel is great. you should watch it. He is a professional YouTuber, man. And Matthew Barrett, in his volume, it's telling the story of the Reformation as one not of sort of schism and departure fundamentally, but fundamentally of renewal of the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. So it's possible, hang with me, to think of Baptists as a renewal movement within this broader renewal movement within the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. And this was really helpful for me. This sort of continuity really helped me understand how my Baptist convictions may rise from the Catholic deposit. In other words, I thought of Baptist identity as a development within the church, not a departure from the church. Now, I get it. Let me address some of you who are here and disagreeing, maybe Roman Catholic, but specifically other Reformed traditions, who are like, man, I reject the idea that Baptists are continuing the logic of the Reformation into ecclesiology, or I reject, all of these things. I get it. There are lots of things. I'm just communicating at a more popular level and debates that are worth engaging that I am not here engaging. This is part history, part theology, and part autobiography. This Catholic and reformational context gave me what I needed to more fully embrace my Baptist identity. I began to think of being Baptist less as just being different over here and more of being faithful within one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. Listen, we might be wrong. I might be wrong. I might be wrong on all sorts of things. Maybe some of you listening are Baptists. Maybe some of you listening will become Baptists. I wouldn't try to convince you really in this space, as long as I would convince you of the glory of Jesus, the beauty of Jesus, the truthfulness of his word. And I hope you see how Baptist theology rises from the scriptures, how we think about it in terms of history, and maybe if you find it compelling to be Baptist, then you certainly could. I am more interested in helping people who are like me, helping people who are broadly evangelical, intentionally Baptist, but maybe a little bit ignorantly Baptist. Think about, how does my Baptist identity connect to the broader Christian story? The funny thing is that a lot of the people who don't like this project, I think, should be most thankful for it. And what I mean by that is, you hear all the time anecdotal evidence of people leaving Baptist life to go to become Anglicans or something else. But then you hear about Anglicans leaving to become Roman Catholics or to become Eastern Orthodox. There's all kinds of stories anecdotally about people who are looking for things. And there's an element of inevitability to that we are wanderers as people, and we are always looking for some urges to be satisfied. But by using the term Catholicity, I'm not trying to test the borders of Baptist identity. I'm trying to contextualize the borders of Baptist identity within one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, so that people who want rootedness in the Christian tradition think of their own tradition as a part of that and don't feel like they need to leave their tradition to be in a more historically aware tradition, to be in an aesthetically more historically robust tradition, if you will. So I think some of my project might be helping people like me. Again, I don't know how many there are on this front, but helping people like me stay Baptist. So if you're worried, man, I'm worried about Mason. I'm worried he doesn't see these Baptist distinctives. I'm worried that he is trying to compromise them or trying to get to a lowest common denominator. I would say that is certainly not the case. I just believe there is a universal Catholic Church. That union is fundamentally, though not exclusively, spiritual. That's the good old evangelical Baptist in me. And I confess that local churches, while not the extent of the Catholic Church, they are really Catholic. They contain real Catholicity. I believe in the centrality of these local churches. The Bible generally speaks to local, gathered, embodied groups of people. A church we enter by faith, with ordinances or sacraments. How should we explain that? Future episode, stay tuned. With ordinances or sacraments that correspond to this conviction. We baptize believers, and so communion is for people who come into the church through baptism, who are believers. I believe in congregational governance, that Christ has given the keys to the kingdom to the gathered body. I believe that gathered body can entrust a plurality of elders to lead them and deacons to serve them. And I believe that faith is the beating heart of all of this. That faith, central to our identity, central to our ecclesiology, like it cannot be coerced. Therefore, I believe in religious liberty for all people. For in these conditions, faith can truly flourish. And frankly, I believe all of these things to be biblical. I articulate Baptist identity completely differently than I did when I was 15 years old, let alone 10 years ago. But not as much has changed as I might have thought. Much, however, has deepened, has been nuanced, has been contextualized, and I guess some things corrected. We'll say more about Baptist faith and practice in a separate episode. We'll talk about the Southern Baptist Convention specifically. We'll talk about things which complicate this more Catholic vision of Baptist identity, but not right now. Today was a little theology, a little history, and a little autobiography. So I ask you, how do you wrestle with your own tradition? How do you wrestle with what it means to be Christian as a Baptist, as a Methodist, as a Presbyterian, Lutheran, whatever you might be? How do you think the Bible defines the church? Who should lead the church? How should she be led? How should we think about the sacraments, baptism, the Lord's Supper? Are those the only ones? Are there more? My challenge to you is not necessarily to become Baptist. My challenge to you is to consider these things. Why do you believe them the way that you do? How do you hold those convictions? How do you think about those convictions in conversation with the broader Christian church? Because I think those things matter. Thanks for joining us. Please like, subscribe, rate, review, do whatever it is that we're supposed to say at the end of these videos. And I hope you'll come back next time.